All right, good evening, everybody. We're back to our class. This is a bit of a later posting than normally would have happened. I had a bit of a busier week. In any case, this kind of fell through the cracks. So, in any case, we are back now today. We will be hosting these videos going forward digitally here on YouTube for the time being until such time as the restrictions are lifted and we have a little bit more of a favorable restriction thing, and also the numbers of the people who are actually attending in person has started to fall off. So I thought it'd be better just to do this from home, save us all the trouble of driving out there, particularly me setting this stuff all up and getting it ready to go. So in any case, I look forward to the day when we can be together again in the church and talking about church history. So, just to prove that I am cool, just as an aside, if you're ever wondering, is Amos cool? You might have been seeing over there, I have a Lego Star Destroyer. So that should prove my credentials to you that I'm a very cool, if somewhat nerdy person. But that is not what kept me from this class. Other things did, but it was certainly a fun build. So, in any case, I want to show that off. And you can see my whole collection of Lego there arrayed behind me. And I hope it inspires awe and encourages you to follow your dreams, because that's what I am all about, is people following their dreams, I guess. In any case, we're going to start today, and we're going to start with a man, or we're going to talk about a man who had a huge impact on the medieval church and was certainly the most powerful of the popes of the Middle Ages, and a man who has had a significant impact on the Catholic Church even up to this day. And that, of course, is a guy called Pope Innocent III. And, oh, my camera is missing. I'm going to move it. There we go. So in any case, we're going to be talking about Pope Innocent III today. And as you can see, 1198 was his reign, started to 1216. So this is the era known as the High Middle Ages. So Pope Innocent III, he is born as Lothario or Lothario, it's quite a Lothario's name, de Conti in Gravignano in Italy around 1160. His father was a count from a family which ultimately produced 9 popes. So this is a fairly prominent Italian noble family. And just as an aside, if this interests you, that means that he was from a family that produced 3.4% of all popes who have existed up until this point. Just to give you an idea, that means that if you look at Harvard's acceptance rate from 2020, it was 4.6%. So which means that he may have gotten into Harvard and he was from a much more exclusive family than Harvard was. So if you want to ask what is better, to be elected Pope from the Conti family or to get into Harvard, like being elected Pope is better than getting into Harvard. So there you go. If you're ever wondering how exclusive his family is, there's an idea. He is born or he's educated in Rome, and he possibly studied law at the University of Bologna, which is one of the oldest universities in Europe, well known for its program in law in the Middle Ages, particularly in canon law. And he also studied theology at the University of Paris. So we haven't really talked about the universities at all, but in terms of theological schools in the Middle Ages, Paris is probably at the top of the list. A lot of theological disputes are settled or on the opinion of the scholars of the University of Paris. So this is a fairly prestigious institution. And being a high-ranking nobleman from a good family, studying or working in the church, he holds a variety of church offices under 5 popes before he becomes a cardinal in 1191. So in 1198, the 85-year-old Pope, Pope Celestine III, dies, and he had previously given his support for his successor to a cardinal named Giovanni di San Paolo. The cardinals, however, were offended a little bit by this recommendation by the former pope because they felt that papal elections were their purview. They had the right to elect who the Pope was. And so if they ever wanted to maintain their freedom and not allow the Pope to choose their successor, they basically had to not select San Paolo. So they elected Innocent the Third on the second ballot on the day that Celestine the Third died. So the day the Pope died, on the second ballot they elected this guy. That's a really short time frame, particularly for the Catholic Church, which can take anywhere from weeks to years in some cases in history, to elect a Pope. So he's elected at the age of 37, relatively young man, and despite the fact that he is a cardinal, he had to be ordained a priest and consecrated a bishop before he could take office. And this was common, actually. It was common for cardinals and even bishops in some cases to be, or abbots or churchmen of, who are in charge of certain offices, to be selected for their political connections and affiliations rather than for their priestly qualifications. And so it was common that in the Middle Ages, or at least it happened relatively frequently, that someone appointed or elected to a high church office had to then undertake being consecrated as a priest and ordained a priest and consecrated as a bishop before they could take their high office. So that seems really weird to us, but that's the way it worked. And it kind of goes again to sort of the corruption of the church as it's gone forward. Innocent is going to be the most powerful and temporally influential popes of the Middle Ages. Excuse me. He has a very clear and a very high view of the authority of the Pope and the power of his office. And he asserted that he had absolute authority over all spiritual matters. While he supported the notion of kings and princes being supreme in the secular realm, he did not concede that they had any equality with himself. He considered himself a level above them. So the emperor's emperor, if you will. And he subscribed to a political theory that was common in the Middle Ages known as the sun and the moon. So basically, this theory says that the Pope is like the sun, and secular rulers are like the moon. The sun is the source of light that the moon reflects or relies on for its lesser light. So the moon receives its power from the sun, which is capable of withholding that light if needed. And as you can see, that's a pretty controversial thing. I don't know how many kings would go along with this, but certainly this was the view of the church and the Pope, and they really kind of went forward with this, or they moved forward with this kind of thought that they are the sort of the sun, and everybody else is kind of reflecting the power that they give to them, but they are in fact supreme. And so again, the battle between church and state, not yet over, still very much in view at this time. So political theory is really good to discuss. It's a lot of fun to debate. I took at least one or two political theory classes when I was at the University of Manitoba. But political theory is all well and good in discussion, but in practice it can be a very different thing. And this theory would be repeated by Boniface VIII in a bull where he proclaims the theory of the two swords, spiritual and temporal. So you have the political theory of the sun and the moon, and then that is now augmented later on by Pope Boniface VIII as the two swords, spiritual and temporal. So the spiritual sword outranks the judge and judges the temporal. Unfortunately, Boniface was not as successful as Innocent was in imposing his own authority over Europe, but nonetheless, this is sort of how the church sees things at this time. So if you ever see a photo, now if you ever watch when Queen Elizabeth attends a church service, you will see that in front of her is carried a sword, and that sword is sheathed, and that is a symbol of her authority as head of the Church of England. So again, the spiritual sword. When you see when she's being preceded in a formal procession in Parliament, she is preceded by an unsheathed sword, a bare blade, and that is the sword of state, and that represents her authority over justice matters. So these symbols are still with us today. These medieval kind of symbols and these symbols of medieval kind of political thinking are still with us today. So Innocent III, unlike other popes, he didn't have a fear of temporal rulers, and he excommunicated several of them actually without much problem. So he excommunicated in his reign Alfonso the Ninth of Leon. Leon is a part of Spain, which was separate kingdoms at the time, and he excommunicated him twice for contracting a marriage outside the laws of the church. Two times Alfonso the Ninth did this. So his first wife was a first cousin, and his second wife was a first cousin once removed. Now, in terms of our own laws here in Canada, I do believe that it is legal in this country to marry your first cousin. In other places in the United States, I believe there are some states where that is banned, but by and large, you can marry your first cousin in our country, and that wouldn't be a problem. But for Innocent and the church, that was a bit of a problem. And he did the same thing with the Crown Prince of Portugal, and to rectify the excommunication, the Crown Prince, when he became king, he submitted the kingdom to the vassalage of the Pope. So he became the Pope's vassal, his feudal subject. He vigorously opposed secular authorities having anything to do with the selection of bishops. And he considered the selection of bishops to be his own personal prerogative as the Pope. The selection of bishops was an issue in the Middle Ages because oftentimes, depending on where you were in Europe, the selection of bishops was a matter for chapters. So, for example, in Canterbury, it was common for the chapter, which is sort of the group of monks at Canterbury Cathedral, to exercise the right to elect the archbishop, which would then be confirmed by the church and by the crown. Didn't always happen that way, and in other places in Europe, of course, secular rulers claimed the right to at least influence who the bishop was. But Innocent opposed all of this, and he considered the appointment of bishops to be his own personal prerogative. So while he would probably rubber stamp bishops who were selected according to traditional means, if he was attempting to flex his muscles, he would certainly go ahead and overrule it if he wanted to. He also reinforced papal claims and rule over the papal states of central Italy, and he opposed foreign interference in them, as any pope did. That's not a change in papal policy, but he was a bit of a canny actor. So Pope Innocent III was very wary, as many popes were, particularly of Germanic designs on the papal states. So when the Emperor Henry VI died, his infant son Frederick was placed in Innocent's guardianship by his mother. So basically what happened was when Henry VI died, his mother said, well, the Pope will be his guardian, his legal guardian going forward. And then she also died. And when she died, she willed to the church the overlordship of the Kingdom of Sicily, which was something that she had. Frederick, then, as the heir to the kingdom through his mother, but under the guardianship of the Pope named him King of Sicily. And this returned Sicily essentially to the sphere of influence of the Pope. After it had been surrendered by Pope Adrian IV several decades earlier. So the Pope has, so Sicily, which had been in the Germanic sphere of influence, is now back under papal influence, particularly since its king is an infant or a child at this time. So Italian politics are always difficult, and in this case, they are as well. So the death of Henry VI caused confusion in the Holy Roman Empire over the succession to the crown. The Pope did not want to be surrounded by imperial territory, and he wanted imperial officers out of Italian territories that he claimed. So basically, for a lot of Italy's history, as you'll probably remember, it was common for the German Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, controlled a significant amount of territory in northern Italy. The Pope and the Papal States controlled territories in central Italy, and then southern Italy was generally ruled as the Kingdom of Sicily. And the Pope, under Henry VI, had been surrounded by Germanic territories because Sicily was under the influence of the Germans. But now Innocent is looking to move as many Germanic officials out of Italy as possible. And he supported, therefore, the Duke of Brunswick, a guy named Otto, the Duke of Brunswick, for the imperial throne, as opposed to as opposed to Henry VI's family. So remember, the Holy Roman Empire is an elected office. The Holy Roman Emperor is an elected emperor. And so there's going to be an election, and the Pope says, I support Otto, the Duke of Brunswick, who is of the House of Welf, for the crown. And of course, he is opposed by members of Henry VI's family, who is the House of Hohenstaufen. So the Pope used the succession crisis, the crisis gives him political cover to expel imperial feudal lords from the Italian regions of Ancona, Spoleto, and Perugia. The papal legate in Cologne then announced in 1201, so this is Innocent's representative, that Otto had been crowned the King of the Romans by the Pope. And this is a first step to being elected Holy Roman Emperor. So before you're made emperor, you're crowned King of the Romans. And this gave Otto's claim a little bit more papal, a papal stamp of approval. And the legate also then threatened that anybody who did not support Otto would be excommunicated. So he's really upping the ante here. So while this is going on, Innocent also forms a league of city-states in Tuscany to oppose imperial influence and places them under his protection. He then issues a bull espousing his view on imperial elections. He states, the German prince-electors have the right to elect the emperor. This right was delegated by the papacy when the imperial office was moved from Constantinople to Charlemagne. If you remember, when the Empress Irene takes on the throne of Constantinople, the Pope say, no, sorry, women can't inherit the imperial throne, and they declare Charlemagne to be the true emperor. And so this is an action of the papacy, and of course the Pope crowned Charlemagne, so he is asserting his rights here. The Pope, he says, has the absolute right to investigate the emperor-elect to determine if the imperial dignity belongs to him. He cannot be expected to consecrate and crown an apostate, a pagan, or a heretic. And he's saying, look, guys, I have the right to investigate whether the guy you elected is actually right for this job. I mean, I can't be expected to crown some inappropriate person. And if the Pope finds a candidate unworthy, the princes must elect someone else. And if they refuse, the Pope may appoint someone, as the church needs a patron to protect it from secular enemies. So he says, like, if you guys can't decide on an appropriate candidate, I get to decide, because the church cannot be left without a protector, which is the emperor's one of the emperor's main responsibilities is to defend and protect the church from non-Christian enemies. So in the event of a tie or a dual election, the Pope also declared that he has the right to determine who the emperor is. Of course, this did not go well. So despite papal support, Otto was only able to secure his throne when his rival was murdered. So he wasn't able to get political support from the German princes. There was only intrigue and backstabbing, literally, that managed to secure him the throne. And after he became the emperor, he reneges on his promises to the Pope, and he sets about attempting to reassert German authority in Italy. He even claimed the kingdom of Sicily, which Innocent had given to Frederick, who is the son of Henry VI. So this now divides Europe. So the French ally with the Pope, and the English, under King John, ally with Otto. Otto is defeated at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214 by the French, and Frederick, the son of Henry VI, is declared the emperor. And so this starts to pull Frederick out of the papal sphere. So another significant event that kind of demonstrates Innocent's authority happens in England. And in 1205, the Archbishop of Canterbury died. English kings had traditionally had a large influence over ecclesiastical appointments in England, but that power had been steadily eroding. King John wanted to appoint a guy named John de Grey, a supporter of his, as the new archbishop. The cathedral chapter of Canterbury said that they had this exclusive right to select the new archbishop, and they had picked a guy named Reginald, who was one of their own members. The bishops of the ecclesiastical province of Canterbury also claimed the right to select the archbishop, and so they selected a different guy. So the king bullied the cathedral chapter into supporting John de Grey, But the Pope rebuffed both Reginald and John de Grey, and he supported a new guy named Stephen Langton. And John refused to accept Langton, but the Pope was having none of it, and he consecrated him as the Archbishop anyway. So John, this makes him angry, of course, and he declares that the Pope was overly swayed by the kings of France. The kings of France are exercising too much authority here. And so the Pope, and so the king decides that there's too much foreign interference. And we've heard a lot about foreign interference in the last few years in elections and selections of bishops and whatnot, so or presidents anyway. And so John is saying the same thing's happening here. Echoes of Donald Trump. And the king decides that he's going to bar Langton from England, so he essentially banishes him. He then seizes the land of the Archbishopric of Canterbury and other papal possessions and starts using the revenue for his own purposes. John also refused Innocent's overtures to come to terms with him, and in 1208, Innocent had enough, and he places England under the interdict. So what's the interdict? The interdict is a tool where a bishop, archbishop, legate, or pope prohibits the conduct of religious services, including communion, but excluding the last rites for the dying and baptisms of newborns. So all religious services, masses, communions, are barred. The only thing that's allowed are last rites for the dead and communion for infants. This means you can't have a funeral. John was enraged, and he considered Innocent to have declared war on him. So essentially, the interdict is the excommunication of an entire country by denying them the offices and the benefits of the church. And this is an important thing because this can cause rulers a lot of problems with their people. John, or clergy in England who followed the interdict had their land seized, and John imposed hefty fines on the lands of his opponents who fled to the continent in support of the Pope. John refused the Pope's overtures and was excommunicated himself personally in 1209. So the interdict was not having the effect that the Pope wanted it to have on John. John was pretty okay. It was really having the negative effect the most on the people, as these things usually do. When it comes to negative policies and fights and wars and battles and taxation, all that kind of stuff, all the burden always falls on the little guy. That happens today, and it happened back then. And so the people are really suffering here. They don't have the comfort of the church anymore. And so the Pope, seeing that it's not really doing anything to John, decides to ease the interdict somewhat for the good of the people. John, meanwhile, has become increasingly concerned about the threat of invasion by France. Since he is excommunicated personally and England is under the interdict, it is very possible that the French could invade him. So it was very possible that the French might invade him and attack him because there'd be no prohibition against it because he's excommunicated and his country is under the interdict. So the Pope would have no reason to interfere on his behalf. So in 1213, John agrees to reconciliation with the church, which means he's going to become a vassal of the Pope and he's going to compensate the church for its losses. Now, for John, this isn't a big deal because he's actually made a lot of money from the church lands that he seized in the meantime. So the question is, who won this battle? Well, the Pope reconciled with John and the church, and while contemporary chroniclers considered the result a humiliation for John, having to submit himself to the Pope and having to become his vassal and then submitting England as a vassalage state to the Pope, John received in return papal support for the rest of his life and papal political protection. So John really comes out in the end on top of this thing. And he also made a lot of money from the seized lands of the church before he had to return them. John only ever repaid 33% of the compensation that was required of him, and the Pope basically forgave the rest of the debt. And the reason why John seemingly submitted himself to the Pope later at this time was because he was getting into a fight with his barons in the Civil War, and they were forcing him to undertake, and they forced him to sign the Magna Carta. So basically, John got into a war with his barons. He lost, and the barons at Runnymede in 1215 forced him to basically limit the powers of the crown. So the English barons, so this is called Magna Carta. You've probably heard that word before, at least I hope so. So basically, Magna Carta was a charter that limited the king's power and guaranteed the rights of representation and property ownership to the nobility. A lot of people think that this guarantees rights to the common guy. No, the main beneficiaries of this are the nobility. It instituted jury trials and it limited the king's arbitrary power to arrest and detain people without trial. But it was heavily weighted in the baron's favor. This is not a pro common person document. So John hates these limits, as any absolute monarch does, and he immediately declares that he had been forced to sign these under duress. I was forced to. I didn't mean it. And the Pope, as his feudal overlord, is able to annul Magna Carta, and the barons revolt again. And the war goes on. So remember when we were talking about King John earlier, and I said that he was a pretty good administrator, but he had a really terrible personality. Well, this is where you see it coming out. He kind of alienates everybody that he needs. So Innocent III vigorously prosecuted heresy. He sent many missionaries to southern France to try and restore the Cathars to the church. Of course, they failed, and one of his legates was even murdered by the Cathars. And due to this, he initiates what's called the Albigensian Crusade to stamp out the Cathars in southern France. So the Albigensian Crusade, like many other crusades, was a very cruel and bloody affair that was used by the French crown as an excuse to stamp out heresy, or by the crown to conquer territory in the south of France, because remember, the French king only has that small Ile-de-France thing as his personal dominion. So he's looking to expand his influence and his power. And the church uses it to stamp out heresy. Innocent III, despite launching this crusade, he protests many of the brutal aspects of the campaign, much like he did with the Fourth Crusade and Constantinople, but it didn't have much success. He also initiates the Fourth Crusade, and he declared that, if we remember back to the crusading lectures, he declares that the loss of Jerusalem and the failure of the Third Crusade was due to the sinfulness of the Crusaders, and he orders a new crusade to be preached in Europe, and this leads to the Fourth Crusade. Now, despite successfully arranging a crusade, the Fourth Crusade was co-opted, as we've discussed before, by the Venetians to settle old scores with various Mediterranean kingdoms that have revolted against them, and also to defeat an already weakened Byzantine Empire. The empire, of course, being a territorial and a trading competitor to the Venetians for quite some time. You'll also remember that he excommunicated the participants of the crusade after learning of the sack of Constantinople, which was something he had expressly forbidden, but of course it didn't make much of a difference. Innocent also calls the Fourth Lateran Council, and this is probably the most significant thing that he did as Pope. So he approves the foundation of the Franciscan order. He calls and then he calls the Fourth Lateran Council. And the council was established to reform aspects of the church and to declare the church's position on certain practices and beliefs. So this is where the doctrine of transubstantiation is formalized in the church. So the doctrine of transubstantiation says that when the priest pronounces the blessing over the cup or over the bread and the wine, that bread and wine then becomes physically the body and the blood of Christ. It is not representative like we believe. We hold to, as Protestants, we hold to a belief that the bread and the wine are representative. They don't actually become the flesh and the blood of Christ when we consume them, but that is the position of the Catholic Church, and that is confirmed here at this council. Now, not everybody is on board with this. There's never universal agreement on everything, but in this case, this is what the Church declares, and it's what they declare today. So that error begins here. The council placed the burden of proving a heretical charge true or false on the accused. It's not up to the accuser, it's up to the accused. It also declared the Pope superior to all other patriarchs, so this helps to formalize his superiority over every other member of the clergy. He set the rules for accusations and trials of the clergy and ecclesiastics. So no clergy or ecclesiastics are to be tried civilly for their crimes. They must only be tried by church courts. And so he sets that in place, which again is will bring the church into conflict with the secular power at times. He decreed that schools should be established in cathedrals for the teaching of theology to the clergy. Now, you're wondering, why hasn't this been happening before? But remember, the clergy of the Middle Ages, by and large, are illiterate. They only know enough to perform the Mass, and this they've probably memorized. So they've learned by rote the service for the Mass, but they may not even understand the Latin. And they certainly, many of them, could not read the Bible. And so Innocent quite rightly decides that this is a terrible situation, and so the council orders that schools be established in the cathedral to actually teach clergy the basics of theology, and also to kind of prep them a little bit for being clergy. This should kind of go without saying, but again, the corruption of the church is pretty deep at this point. The Fourth Lateran Council also barred new religious orders, so new monkery or new monasteries are barred. Basically, if you want to establish a new monastery, you have to pick an existing order to make it a part of. It also declared that abbots and priors must hold chapter meetings every 3 years minimum, so they have to meet with their people every 3 years. Because again, the corruption of the church, you're appointed an abbot, you take on the authority and the prestige of the office, but you don't necessarily conduct regular meetings of your priory or of your monastery or of the people you oversee. So it's important that this at least happen once every 3 years. The council barred clergy from acts of wantonness and drunkenness and attending inappropriate plays like farces and other things. Clerics are barred from being involved in pronouncing or carrying out death sentences, and this basically ends the whole concept of trials by ordeal. So you may have heard of this where, if you have a trial by fire, you may, take a very hot, they may take, a piece of iron, put it in a fire, heat it up to very hot, then they put it in your hand, and then you hold it, and then your hand is then taken and placed in water and then bandaged. And if the hand heals after a prescribed amount of time, you are innocent. God has declared you innocent. And if it's festering and pus-filled and all that kind of stuff, then you are guilty. And you need to have clergy oversee that because you need God to obviously tell you who is guilty and who is not. And when the clergy were barred from carrying out death sentences, they were essentially, this ends trial by ordeal because that's usually what followed. It decreed that churches must be kept clean. Wow. All Christians must confess their sins a minimum of once per year. And clergy have to hear confessions of their flock. Very important. Also, clergy shall not take oaths to princes without cause, and princes shall stay out of church matters. Good luck with that one. Excommunications cannot be bought or discharged with money. Paying tithes must take priority over paying taxes. Again, secular civil divide being challenged there. The selling of church offices, known as simony, is barred, and the offering of money to join religious orders is barred. This gives you a real idea of how corrupt the church had gotten. Illiterate clergy, uneducated clergy who participated in ribald acts of drunkenness, wantonness, probably sexual immorality. You have churches that are not being clean, priests who are not meeting with their parishioners who are not being able to confess. All these sorts of things going on, and the council is really attempting to deal with these things. Jews were barred from charging extortionate interest rates. Jews and Muslims must wear special clothing. Jews barred from holding public offices, and converted Jews are not allowed to reconvert back to Judaism. So again, this is kind of it's aimed at Jews, a lot of this stuff too. Jews often were barred from many of the trades, and so oftentimes the only thing they could do had to do with things that charged interest, like lending money, because Christians were not actually allowed to charge interest by the church. So only the Jews could do that. And here they're saying, well, you can't charge extortionate rates. So the Fourth Lateran Council also called for the Fifth Crusade, but Innocent died in 1216 before it left. So the Fourth Lateran Council, I think, is really interesting because it is essentially an admission of the church's failings up to this point, of the corruption that had seeped into it. It was an attempt to reform the church, but not to reform it in a manner not to reform its beliefs or its practices, but to attempt to reform the actions of the people. So essentially saying, we want you to reform your actions, not necessarily your heart. And that was the whole point of the Reformation, was that it's not just enough to change behaviors, we have to also change the theology. We have to get the underlying basis of what we believe correct before we can expect our behaviors to be in line with our theology. So this attempt to reform the church really demonstrates, because of its decrees, it demonstrates the corruption that the church had been in up to this time. But it doesn't actually make the lasting changes that it needs to at the core root of everything, which was the need to reform the theology of the church, which will come in the Reformation 200 or so years later, or 300 or so years later. So this is kind of one of the major attempts in the Middle Ages to reform the church, and it really doesn't pan out, as we'll see, because the Reformation happened. So anyway, that's it. That's Innocent III. That was a bit of a shorter lecture than normal. So next week, hopefully, we will discuss some theological points, or next class, rather, I should say, we should discuss some theological points of the Middle Ages. We'll get into the proto-reformers, and then we'll jump into the Reformation. Probably take a break before that, though. If you have any questions, please email me. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Thank you.